morning, everybody. I think we're all very appreciative, of the rain. Maybe we'll get some more, but we must thank God for that very special encounter with Him through the rain, through nature. I always like to think of that. Better than the heat of the desert, even though God has created everything. I prefer the rain rather than the heat of the desert. And after many years of living in Phoenix, it's really never hot here for me. It might be hot for you, I understand, but all those years in Phoenix, oh gosh. Anyway, in the first reading today from the book of Genesis, Abraham does not realize that we'll find out that he is encountering, and that's the word I want to zero in on, and that was in the introductory words today that were read by Debbie. He doesn't realize that he is encountering the presence of God when he goes above and beyond, because all of the preparations that he has done, as we heard, he goes above and beyond what is expected in his culture as he welcomes the traveling strangers on a hot afternoon. After all, wouldn't a cup of water be enough? And let's move on. Okay, but no, he has to tell Sarah what to do and get everything prepared. He just goes above and beyond. And it's we'll find out that only after one of the visitors tells him that his elderly wife Sarah will bear a son, Abraham is surprised that his encounter has then been with God, with the presence of God. And then moving forward with St. Paul in that second reading today in the Scriptures, who had already encountered, we read about that in the Acts of the Apostles, he had already encountered the presence of the risen Lord before he was converted on his way to Damascus, when he was going to arrest Christians and put them in prison. And he today says in that second reading that he had been called to reveal the mystery hidden from ages and from generations past. So Paul wants to tell the people of Colossae, the Colossians, a city in southwestern, más o menos, in southwestern Turkey, just as we are called to listen today, because we believe that Scripture is alive for us, it's just not a piece of history, to know that this mystery he is talking about was his encounter with the love of the risen Christ when he was thrown off of his horse on the way to Damascus to arrest Christians and throw them into prison. And he wants the people of Colossae, us, ourselves as well, to be in touch with the encounters we have with Christ as we go about our daily lives. Now, that's easy to say and very difficult to do, It's very difficult to do, to be more present to these encounters. In 2005, Pope Benedict the 16th wrote an encyclical called God is Love. He said, "We have come to believe in God's love. Catholicism," he said, "is not an idea in our heads. Being Christian, being Catholic, is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives us in our lives a new horizon, a new way of looking at the world, and a new decisive direction." He concludes, "Since God has first loved us, love is now no longer a command. It is the response on our part to the gift of love with which God draws near to us." So I think that is what St. Paul says when he is trying to say the mystery hidden from ages and from generations past. He is asking us, I think, to be in touch with our encounter with the love of God in the risen Christ. And I think this is what defines us, in our Catholic culture. It should define really any Christian. We don't live in our heads with dogmas, doctrines, and a set of ethics. I'm not saying that that's not important. We need all of those things that help to define us and give us direction as a Catholic community. But I don't believe in the love of God because of a dogma, a doctrine, or a set of ethics. They're a good foundation for me, but if I'm not acting out of love, then what am I doing? So we live our Catholicism because we have encountered God's love. You might ask yourself, well, where is it that I've encountered God's love? Or maybe we have not had an encounter with the love of the risen Christ. I think all of us have, but sometimes we just don't recognize it. We just don't recognize it. But if we have been aware of this encounter, then we will live a life of love that can be quite radical and can, in some instances, cause us then to be persecuted. I told you that story, I believe, once on a hot afternoon in July at my parish at St. Matthew's. I'd come from the church. I was locking the gate to walk across the parking lot over to the office, the rectory, and where I was at St. Matthew's, 21st Avenue in Van Buren, is not a very nice part of the city, has a lot of colorful people, and this lady of the street said, or I saw her and I'd seen her before. I looked over across the street and went, oh no. I've got to get over to the office before she comes after me or for something. I just know that's going to happen. So I quickly locked the gate, walking over across the parking lot. It's hot. I'm in my collar. I want to get into the door. I don't want to have an encounter with her. I get to the door and she's right there. Well, how did you get here so darn fast? So there she is. And she says, you know what, Father? I should not be standing in front of you. And I said to myself right away, this is an encounter with God. You better pay attention, Raymond. She says, will you pray for me? And I said, oh, sure, I'll put your name on our prayer list. What's your name? And she says, oh, no. And she grabs my hands, and she says, I want you to pray for my mother who has cancer. I can't remember if it was in North Carolina, Georgia, wherever, in the southeast. She has cancer, and will you pray for her? So I prayed. And then she says, oh, thank you so very much. And then she let go of my hands and walked away. And I never saw her again. Now, I think that was an encounter for me to wake up. A priest, you better wake up. So I think all of us have these encounters. Sometimes we're just not aware of them. We're just not conscious of them. It is said that no one can get into heaven without a letter of reference from the poor. In other words, it is vitally important for each of us to be conscious and not to ignore our encounters with the love of the risen Christ on any given day with someone who might be in need. You know, after all, in today's gospel from Luke, Mary did not anticipate her powerful encounter with Jesus. We are called to welcome him as well, choosing to spend time with him in his presence, not only in prayer, but most especially when we encounter him, the resurrected Christ, in the vulnerable and the needy. And so to quote Jesus' words to Mary today, her encounter with him is, he says, the better part, and it will not be taken from you. And so I think this applies to our encounters with our neighbor. You know, as we are baptized as infants, or maybe some of you were later in life, but most of us were baptized as infants. Water was poured upon us, or we were immersed. We were clothed in a white garment, and after all of that, the priest anoints us with chrism oil on the crown of our heads. And he says, I anoint you priest, prophet, and king. In other words, we share in the kingship of Jesus Christ, we share in his priesthood, but we also are called to be prophetic. We are called to be prophets in this modern world. And I think it's part of the ritual that just gets bypassed quickly and we think nothing of it. But we have to be reminded that each of us share in the kingship, the priesthood, but in the being prophets as Jesus Christ was. And so the love of the risen Christ often comes in the face of the stranger, that was mentioned in the introductory rites today, and challenges us with the decision of whether or not to receive prophetically the stranger, either with hostility or with hospitality. Am I intentionally at times being cruel when turning my back on those in need, or am I intentionally being hospitable? We never get it right. I'm the first to admit it. I am the guilty one. I confess it. So none of us ever gets it correct, but that's why we're here. So, and I'm not talking about charity, I'm not talking about charity, getting somebody a burger at Burger King. They're sitting by the way of the road, and I stop and get a burger for that person and give it to the person. I'm on my way. Or I give somebody a ride between here and, let's say, Safeway. That's fine. That's good. But there's nothing wrong with that, but that's the bare minimum. Anyone can do that. Even a non-believer can do that. You don't have to be Christian to do that. Yet as a baptized Christian, I am challenged to take the opportunities to broaden my love of God further and to be in solidarity then with the human family. So, you can think of a number of different issues. You can think of a number of different issues that we need to act upon, either as individuals or that we need to act on collectively, as a nation. And some of those issues we might be in agreement with, we might not be in agreement with. We might look at the issue that I'm just startled by, that all of that money that was taken away from U.S. aid, money that went to, feed so many, mostly women and children in other parts of the world. And I think to myself, how could we do that? We're much more generous than that as a nation. We always have been. And I just don't think that is correct. There was an article in the newspaper that said Trump is right that U.S. aid needed to be reformed, but American aid overall still saved about one life every 10 seconds based on estimates by the Center for Global Development. The transfer of U.S. aid into the State Department wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea if it were done carefully, but simply shuttering the agency with no transition has been catastrophic. I mentioned this last weekend in a homily, and someone told me, you're politicizing the gospel, Father. You're politicizing the Sunday Eucharist. And I said, rightfully so. I am politicizing because I'm very political, and Jesus was very political, and the Hebrew prophets were very political. Jesus stands on the shoulders of the Hebrew prophets who were either persecuted, exiled, or put to death. Jeremiah, Zechariah, Amos, Micah, Elijah, you can go on. And as we know, what happened to Jesus for being so political and speaking out against the religious and political leaders of his day? Well, we know, as you know as well as I do, that it got him nailed to a cross. So to actively live out our encounters out of our Catholicism, which states, because God loves me, I will then, as a baptized Christian, love others, especially the most vulnerable, with hospitality and not hostility. I will try my best, however I can, because I can't change the system on my own, but to work to change the systems of hate and injustice that disrespect the rights of everyone around us who is in need. So, for the final time, no one can get into heaven without a letter of reference from the poor. So let's pay attention this week, maybe be more conscious of it, of our encounters, sometimes by surprise with the risen Christ. And to say again, as Pope Benedict said, being Christian then is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person which gives us a new direction and a new horizon. Since God has first loved us, love is no longer a command. It is the response on our part to the gift of love with which God draws near to each and every one of us.